It's one of the most famous steam locomotives in the world, a British icon that crossed the Atlantic in search of a new audience. But what started as an ambitious American tour quickly turned into something much more complicated. This is the story of Flying Scotsman's United States tour and the unexpected challenges that nearly derailed it. Built in 1923 for the London and North Eastern Railway, Flying Scotsman quickly became a legend. It was the first steam locomotive to officially reach 100 miles an hour, a symbol of speed and innovation in the golden age of rail travel. For decades, it hauled passenger trains across Britain, becoming the poster boy for the LNER and becoming one of the most recognizable steam engines ever built. But by the 1960s, steam was disappearing from British railways, and Flying Scotsman's future was uncertain. British Railways announced its modernization plan and announced the plans to scrap Flying Scotsman. In 1963, Flying Scotsman was purchased by Alan Pegler, a railway enthusiast determined to preserve it. He had an extreme fascination with the locomotive ever since he was a boy. He saw Flying Scotsman brand new in 1923 at an exhibition. Pegler didn't want to just save the locomotive. He wanted to drive his locomotive. He technically couldn't, as he didn't have a license and education to drive on Britain's mainline metals. But overseas, he could. The United States was not as strict about that back then. So, in 1969, he brought Flying Scotsman to the United States. Prime Minister Harold Wilson supported the tour with promises Pegler would use the tour to promote British companies, a trade show on rails. Before Scotsman could run on American rails, it needed modifications. By law, American steam locomotives need a chime steam whistle, a bell, buckeye couplers, and a cow catcher. So Scotsman was fitted with all of them. After Scotsman was fitted, British Railways transported the famous A3 and the coaches to the docks at Liverpool. The whole consist was loaded aboard the ship first, then the Flying Scotsman. Flying Scotsman's wheels left British soil, and it wouldn't touch it again for another 3.5 years. The first year of the tour was a roaring success. The ships docked at the U.S. Army Depot in Boston, Massachusetts. Southern Railway presented Flying Scotsman with a headlamp for the journey across the United States. Flying Scotsman was given 2 weeks to test the soil of the American rails. While out on trial run, the crew were met by some children throwing stones at the locomotive. One person even fired a shot. On the way back, the crew threw lumps of coal at the attackers. Crowds gathered to see the famous green locomotive in action, something completely different from American steam engines. Scotsman started the 2-month-long journey to Houston, Texas. She was displayed in New York, New Jersey, Philadelphia, Ohio, and Washington, D.C. Along the way, Scotsman took part in a few events with other American steam engines. Scotsman would take part in the Steamorama Festival in Alabama. When they reached Atlanta, Georgia, they met Savannah and Atlanta number 750. 750 took part in traveling with Scotsman. There were several stops where each engine would pass each other to give enthusiasts time for photos. Scotsman and 750 met at the festival with Southern Railway 4501. More than 10,000 people showed up to the event. Towards the end of 1969, Scotsman had to take cover for the winter. The Santa Fe Railroad offered the Slayton Roundhouse in Slayton, Texas, to store the whole consist. The train was split up for the first time since arriving. Pegler noted that this was the first time Scotsman has ever been on a turntable long enough to complete Scotsman's 2 tenders. Behind the scenes, problems were building. Something that Alan Pegler had not accounted for was towage costs. A lot of the metropolitan cities deemed Flying Scotsman as a fire hazard. For example, while in New York City, Scotsman had to be towed into the city by diesel-electric locomotives. These costs began piling up. However, Pegler was determined for the second year of the tour. Just like everything good in this world, Scotsman's tour was messed up by politics. Prime Minister Harold Wilson was replaced by Edward Heath. He didn't see the significance of funding Scotsman's tour and pulled all financial backing from the government. If Pegler wanted to keep the tour going, he would basically have to fund it himself. Pegler was driven by the desire to drive his engine across the country, and they had to drop off 2 Pullman coaches they had to Green Bay, Wisconsin at the National Railroad Museum to be preserved with the LNER A4 there. Pegler chose to keep going. despite the looming costs. Alan Pegler was left struggling to keep the tour alive. The original 1970 tour was changed significantly. Originally, they were meant to travel the West Coast through the Rocky Mountains, then go north into Toronto, Canada for the Canadian exhibition of the tour, and then end at Green Bay to drop off the Pullmans. With such a tight budget, they ditched the West Coast entirely and went straight to Green Bay, and then to the planned Canada stops afterwards. Flying Scotsman's journey began with a bang as they passed through Waco, Texas. The engine derailed. Scotsman's rear bogie had come off due to a broken journal. Scotsman was repaired and continued through Kansas, Missouri, Illinois, and finally entered Green Bay, Wisconsin at the National Railroad Museum. Scotsman was on display for a month in the yard with a fellow LNER locomotive, the A4 class Dwight D. Eisenhower. One of the Pullman coaches, Isle of Thanet, was left with the A4, while the other one, Lydia, remained with Flying Scotsman. Flying Scotsman headed to Toronto, Canada through the St. Clair Tunnel. Scotsman was put on display with the Canadian National Locomotive 6218. After a few days, the crew headed to Ottawa, and Scotsman was on display at the Museum of Science and Technology. A few days later, Scotsman was on display in Montreal, Canada. In the yard, Scotsman was greeted by 6218 again, along with a UAC turbo train and a Canadian National diesel locomotive. They were lined up for a photo shoot. After a few more display events in Canada, Scotsman was stored in the old Spa-Dina Roundhouse for the winter. Unfortunately, the Canadian tour had not made as much money as Pegler had hoped for. Pegler's money was running dry. Bankruptcy was on the horizon. For nearly a year, Scotsman was kept in the shed. Do they eat the huge cost, go bankrupt, and send Scotsman home? Or do they try to make a miracle happen and make up the money in the States? What do you think Pegler chose? Well, if you guessed the latter, you are correct. In San Francisco, there is a city-wide celebration called British Week. Alan Pegler had Britain's most famous and beloved steam engine. If he could get Scotsman to California, it might be enough to not go bankrupt. He decided to throw a Hail Mary and get Scotsman to San Francisco. It wasn't until August of 1971 that the route was finalized. There were no big display events this year, just a straight shot to California within 2 months. Scotsman went over the Niagara River and across the border back to the United States. Scotsman went across the northern states and over the Rocky Mountains down to the west coast, and after an incredibly long journey, Scotsman made it just in time for British Week. Scotsman sat on display at Fisherman's Wharf for several weeks and was the most popular tourist attraction in the city. Pegler also gave rides to tourists. Unfortunately, the restaurants across the street started complaining that Scotsman was blocking the sea view, as well as taking up 92 parking spots. Scotsman was moved into an exchange yard. Now out of sight of tourists, the money started drying up. Pegler was officially declared bankrupt by the High Court with a debt of £132,000. Scotsman was ferried across the bay and transported to the Sharp Army Depot in Lathrop, California. Scotsman was left outside while Pegler tried to pay off his debt. But as much as he tried, the engine was liquidated from Pegler and was now in possession of the United States government. Flying Scotsman sat in storage in Lathrop, California with no owner and was being prepared to be auctioned off. Its future uncertain. Meanwhile, news reached Britain about the fate of Flying Scotsman. A committee was formed to get Scotsman back to England. This is where a wealthy businessman and director of the McAlpine Construction Company, Bill McAlpine, comes into our story. Bill had a fascination for steam locomotives and had a few of his own, which were fully operational. What the committee needed was money, and Bill had it. George Hinchcliffe, the operational manager of Flying Scotsman, was sent over to the States to figure out what was needed to bring Scotsman home. While he was working out a deal, the railroad attorneys were preparing to auction off Flying Scotsman. That night, January 2nd of 1973, George phoned McAlpine and told him the cost. McAlpine agreed and wrote the check. Scotsman was saved and quickly sent back to Britain. Flying Scotsman was scheduled to be restored in Derby. Scotsman went to Derby under its own steam, and over 100,000 people gathered along the route to see the famous engine home again. Its journey across America remains one of the most ambitious and cautionary chapters in railroad preservation. Flying Scotsman still runs to this day and is now under ownership of the National Railway Museum as part of the National Collection, celebrated as a living piece of British history. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for more railroad history.